Sorry, Mr. Davis.
Yeah, Sam Davis. I'm Vice President of Animal Care Australia. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Sure. Now, would either any of you like to make a short opening statement? And if we could try and keep it reasonably short, so we want to get to questions.
Thank you. This week, a woman was brutally murdered. Her alleged killer was at the time already charged with various offences, including aggravated cruelty to an animal. This tragedy again illustrates the link between violence to animals and violence to people, and yet here we still are with a legal framework that is inadequate in protecting both animals and people. On behalf of Cat Protection, I thank the committee for your continued work. I, like many, am deeply disappointed by the lack of action by the government. I was initially surprised that there weren't more submissions to this inquiry, but then I thought this is a consequence of submission fatigue. The animal care and welfare sector has contributed countless pages of thoughtful, considered, evidence-based reports to numerous inquiries into animal welfare regulation over the past few years, but we've seen little change. I expect many simply feel the exercise is futile and they are exhausted attempting to manage the growing challenges in animal welfare. Despite this committee's recommendations, we are none the wiser when it comes to understanding what is and isn't investigated under POCTA. We don't know how reports of cruelty are triaged. We don't know whether responses are driven by resources or by defects in the legislation. We don't know whether there are trends. We don't know what species are subject to complaints or investigation. As Cat Protection says in our submission, this absence of vital data on animal health and welfare also limits the capacity and development of human health and safety policies. The need to address these issues urgently cannot be overstated.
Thank you. Ms. Ward?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today. The Animal Defender's Office shares the general disappointment expressed in a number of the submissions to this inquiry at the lack of progress on key matters such as transparency and accountability since the release of the last committee report of the inquiry into the compliance and enforcement operations of the approved charitable organisations under the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. The lack of transparency in the annual reports of the organisations is particularly disappointing, especially when there is an easy solution. Make public and readily available the reports the organisations are already required to provide the Minister under Section 34B of the Act. There are already detailed specifications for the reports in the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals regulation. No extra work would be required except perhaps the odd redaction. That would go some way to responding to the public's desperate plea for more meaningful and substantive material than the what has been characterised as feel-good PR material that is currently given to the public under the guise of an annual report. Then there is the lack of transparency and accountability for enforcement choices. Bare numbers tell only a small part of the story. For example, the public needs to know broadly what entities are being investigated or prosecuted. Are they individuals or corporations? About which animals and in what sectors? And what animal welfare benefits were there for the animals who were the subject of the investigations or prosecutions, so that the public can assess how well or not our animal welfare laws are working. Finally, the perceived conflicts of interest in having private enforcement agencies embedded with entities that undertake harmful activities such as wildlife culling or animal agriculture must be dealt with. While it is perfectly valid to perform an animal welfare advisory role as experts in the field, it can cause at the very least a perception of a conflict of interest when the same entity is also the entity with investigation and enforcement powers. Several of the concerns raised in submissions to the inquiry could be addressed by having an independent government-funded statutory authority responsible for compliance, monitoring and enforcement of animal welfare laws, the endorsement of which the Animal Defender's Office again places on the record. Thank you.
Thank you. Either Mr. Donnelly or
Yes,
Mr. Davis?
please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also request this statement be tabled. In 2019, Animal Care Australia supported a recommendation that resulted in the creation of this annual inquiry in order to address concerns that the charitable organisations were not accountable for their actions or the services they provide on behalf of the state. Some 5 years later, Animal Care Australia is not in a position to confidently state that much has changed. Having said that, it is pleasing for us to continue to support the ethos of the Animal Welfare League, and while we would like to see some additional breakdown of financial reporting, we wish to make it clear that today the AWL will not be the focus of our testimony. This morning I was originally intending to outline the major points from our submission. Instead, though, I'll simply make the following points. Early 2023, the New South Wales Government gave the RSPCA an additional $20 million for enforcement, and in the same financial year, an additional $10.5 million for various upgrades. This year, the RSPCA testified that $20 million must continue for them to be able to continue to provide that enforcement. RSPCA has their new shelter, shiny new shelter, while other shelters have either closed or are providing a reduced service. Local councils across the state have been told they are now solely responsible for the intake of surrenders. Makes one wonder what filling that shiny new shelter will look like. The CEO and Chief Inspector have publicly stated the RSPCA has a new focus of being enforcers. Perhaps that's due to a potential annual $20 million incentive. Touted as animal welfare experts by the current and previous governments, and yet they supported and were complicit in the removal of a prohibition of aerial culling during foaling season, and then in fact to defend their position claimed there is no such thing as a foaling season. Declared taking an average of 7 to 15 shots to kill a horse meets animal welfare standards. Euthanized 50 birds seized from an animal hoarder, all who had been diagnosed with an affordably treatable disease, something that any bird owner could have completed within a few weeks. Crammed a Great Dane into a small animal carrier, causing injuries, which were called out by the magistrate on those injuries. All after New South Wales Police had declared there was no concern with the dog. Rather than seize the dog, the owner offered to drive the inspectors and the dog to their treating vet a few minutes down the road. The RSPCA could have clarified the treatment history, and even more importantly, if the vet determined it was time for the dog to be euthanased, it could have been done with the family able to say goodbye. This was offered by the owner and rejected by the RSPCA. While not isolated cases, these two examples illustrates the lack of concern about the welfare of the animals and a determination to prosecute the owners at all cost. Since previously appearing at this inquiry, the Queensland Government has altered the procedures the RSPCA Queensland must follow before any prosecution can proceed. They are now being held somewhat more accountable. This falls in line with Western Australia, and in the ACT the DPP prosecute cruelty cases. There is a growing catch cry of what meets the social licence for actions being taken by organisations, and the social appetite for the RSPCA is diminishing. Almost every state has been forced to look at their actions of their RSPCA, and each of them found the need for greater accountability. Importantly, when asked during the Brumby inquiry to explain the RSPCA's position on the welfare impacts of aerial culling, Mr Coleman stated, and I quote, "Any submission that's provided, be it by RSPCA New South Wales or RSPCA Australia, is theoretical in nature, based on references. It's potentially dangerous to restrict certain activities where processes can be improved." End quote. I leave this committee with those words directly relating to the RSPCA's ability to understand animal welfare. The RSPCA's position is theoretical based on references. Animal Care Australia's position is clear. Any enforcement agency must now be employed directly by the government, answerable to a minister, to the Parliament, and therefore to the public. Mr Davis and myself, thank you for allowing us to testify today, and we welcome your questions.
Thank you. I'll now just throw it open to questions. The committee's agreed to just have a free flow of questions, so I'm looking for someone to take up the baton.
Well, ladies first.
Ms Hurst.
Thank you. I might start with Ms Tara Ward, and thank you for coming and giving your time again, as per many inquiries. It's a really unusual situation that we've got, and there's nothing else in our legislation where we rely on a charitable non-government agency to perform government enforcement. I'm just trying to sort of understand, you know, say we set up an independent office of animal welfare, which was actually a government commitment. How do you foresee that sitting in, and how do you see that then either functioning? Does the RSPCA and the Animal Welfare League collapse and removed as in regards to their enforcement, and then it falls under the independent office? How do we structure something like this? How do we structure this change?
Well, that would be the subject of a whole nother inquiry.
Maybe we should have one.
Yeah, I'll see you there if I were to be invited. So just to the sort of broad issues. One imagines that what would, if we were dealing with the current regulatory framework, that the officers of this independent statutory authority would be authorised in the same way, for example, that police officers are authorised with whatever powers Parliament sees fit to give to the officers of this putative body, and that would be a question for Parliament. As to whether they do have enforcement powers, law enforcement powers, which in theory there's no reason why they wouldn't, since we've already given those to private charities.
In regards to the sort of current setup, do you think that we need to have powers within government to fully investigate complaints, to compel documents from those enforcement agencies, to ensure that there's some kind of oversight and transparency? If we weren't going to change into one of these other models, do we need to somehow make sure that there's more oversight and transparency?
I think that's been most of the entities making submissions to this inquiry have been in furious agreement on that point. There definitely needs to be more transparency, if only for the purpose of being able to evaluate how well our animal welfare laws are working. Currently, it's impossible on the information provided to the public, as my fellow panellist Ms. Vesk said as well, how we can identify patterns or where the laws aren't working, as well as, of course, the specific instances where perhaps the powers should not have been exercised. So there definitely needs to be that transparency and then accountability for these hugely important powers that are being used here.
Can I add to that, if I may, and actually answer your question as well, Ms. Hurston? Both of your questions is one. Mr. Fang, we would also welcome an opportunity to appear at such an inquiry that you just implied might occur.
It's not my choice.
But
It's not that powerful.
we would definitely welcome that opportunity to look at some form of an Office of Animal Welfare being developed moving forward that comes under government funding and government control. To answer your other question, Ms. Hurst, yes, the RSPCA and AWL Inspectorate would dissolve and would be re-employed by the government. Inspectorate would be re-employed by the government, and we would support that measure. And we are actually in the processes of developing such a proposal that we would be happily make available to this committee and further once we've finished producing that and making that structure.
Thank you.
Designing it. So, yeah.
Ms. Ward, just going back to the independent office, would you be concerned if this independent office was going to be a single commissioner within the Department of Primary Industries, supported simply by current DPI staff with no additional funding?
Absolutely.
And can you explain why that would be problematic?
Yes, thank you. And I meant to refer to this in answering your previous question when you referred to an entity being established or a government entity. The entity would need to be independent. We can't continue the situation where we have an agency such as the DPI, which, while only administrating the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, nonetheless it has that, as we're all aware, that inherent conflict of interest. It is the agent or the entity responsible for promoting animal industries. We cannot have such an entity in any way associated with the enforcement of animal cruelty laws. The perception and actual conflict of interest would just be too great. So that would certainly not be a solution, go anywhere near providing a solution to the current problems.
And I just want to ask as well, I know that you regularly assist members in the public who make animal cruelty complaints. I'm just wondering if you've noticed if there's any improvement or change in the responsiveness to complaint or enforcement activities generally since the grant of 26 million funding that came in last year? Have you noticed any change?
In a word, no, we haven't. Thank you.
Thank you. And is there anything people can do if they're unhappy with the conduct? I know this is an obvious question, but I just want it for the record. Is there anything that people can do if they're unhappy with the conduct of the RSPCA, if they fail to respond to a cruelty case, fail to prosecute inappropriately? Is there anywhere to report that? And do you know any examples where things have fallen through the cracks that shouldn't have, that you can give as an example to us, where you were concerned that somebody should have had somewhere they could go?
Thank you. Several issues there. Just one is that there are very few avenues for members of the public who are dissatisfied with the performance of the approved charitable organisations in undertaking their functions under the Act. I think the one of them says on their website, if you have, would like to make a complaint, basically you need to complain to the organisation, and I think that is could reasonably be regarded as unsatisfactory. And there's nowhere really to go beyond that. So there are very limited avenues, and that is a systemic problem. We recommend to people, given the absence of any other sort of options, that they can make complaints to the Ombudsman, but that's a sort of long process and it tends to not go very far. In terms of, there is, of course, freedom of information. Now, to its credit, the RSPCA does respond to freedom of information requests under the New South Wales GIPA, Government Information, GIPA,
That's all right.
otherwise known as FOI, Freedom of Information. If that... So that is one avenue, and we have made a few requests and they have responded, but that only takes you so far. There has been, of course, for us, the most obvious incident of where a huge animal welfare issue just fell through the cracks was the truck crash involving 108,000 day-old broiler chicks. And that crashed early one Easter morning near Yass. It took a whole day to clean up, in short, but at the end of which, once everyone, the first responders and council personnel had gone, members of the public found day-old chicks semi-buried, alive. So still alive, and they were. There's video footage of them being extracted from the dirt, still alive. So those members of the public came to the Animal Defenders Office, and we, on their behalf, wrote a very detailed complaint listing also every possible offence under animal welfare laws, codes of practice, etc. That was given to the RSPCA. This was back in the day when 12 months was the limitation period. Basically, it was sat on for the 12 months and no action was ever taken. We contacted at the time, Chief Inspector and asked for an explanation, and we were said that we would be responded to, and we never heard back. And that was when there was the witnesses had made themselves available. There was video footage, so there wasn't a question of absence of evidence, and it was an horrendous incidents of cruelty to these extremely vulnerable animals, being young chickens. So that's one example of, and we've had several more come to our office of, but that's the one that stands out the most.
Thank you.
If I could tack on with what Ms. Ward just said about when you want to make a complaint, you're making a complaint to the actual people that you're complaining about. I would also like to pick up on the evidence provided by the previous witness, in that when you do make that complaint, you're put into a room. You are sat in that room with the inspector that you're complaining about, with the chief inspector, and more
Are
often
you
than
speaking
not,
from personal experience?
I'm
or are
speaking
you-
from some of our members' personal
people who've spoken to you?
experiences. Yes, and more often than not, also the CEO will be in that room as well. That bullying and that intimidation that was witnessed as evidence previously, that is also exhibited in that room. So you are made feel like you are in the wrong. Straight up, they will bully you. They will intimidate you into making you and convincing you that your complaint is pointless, and even to the point of making that kind of statement. Your complaint is pointless. We are not going to look at this. We're not going to do anything about this, and you've got nowhere else you can go. So ha ha ha. See you later. So that kind of behaviour is just It's not just within the office, within the staff. It's actually it actually emanates out into the public as well, and they treat the public in the same way as what they treat their own staff.
And perhaps to add, just the big picture-wise, and getting onto your Office of Animal Welfare, that I presume the government's looking at as well at the moment. The model that we're looking at is to make sure that all the compliance operations come underneath the state government, so that all the transparency and all the accountability that every state officer employed by the state comes into play. And I guess our without preempting what we're going to recommend, in a general sense, in terms of the compliance officers, we'd see there's sort of education type officers who don't come in with tasers and uniforms and the whole business, who are coming in like might happen for a plumber or somebody who's coming to do a check and is sort of saying, look, how about what about doing this or what about doing that? More as a colleague. And then if they see something that's a cruelty thing, then yes, that's got to then be progressed to somebody else. The same as might happen with social workers working for docs. At the end of the day, if they see that there's an offence being, and the person's not responding, well, then you need to call in the police or somebody who's sort of got the big guns to be able to charge them. At the moment, you've got a charitable organisation who's trying to do all that, and in fact is getting rid of all their rescue stuff and trying to focus more on this sort of policing type activity. So, and I think society's saying this has got to happen. It's got to happen. The other issue, some of the cases I'm aware of, I do quite a bit of work with my own local government at Wallandilly. I know that RSPCA don't respond when council rangers, for instance, call them up. Police don't respond because they're like, oh no, call RSPCA. And Wallandilly, as you know, is only really just out of Sydney, and yet RSPCA officers won't come that distance. So how is this possibly managing animal welfare across the whole state? I think effectively where they're operating
Got to
Sydney
follow up
Metro.
as well, and then I'll I know.
the same issues.
Yeah. Oh, actually, mine sort of segues a little bit off something that was said. So, did you want to jump in first?
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Can I just ask, you've mentioned support for an Office of Animal Welfare, and you've indicated some of the characteristics you'd like it to have. Can you point to another agency, not obviously covering animal welfare in New South Wales, but any other agency which has characteristics that you'd like it to have? You mentioned social workers and that approach, or any other state that may be operating a similar facility. I'm interested in the characteristics of what it should look like.
Unfortunately, at the moment, when it comes to animal welfare in particular, there are no other states. The Northern Territory are the only state that don't utilise the RSPCA services when it comes to enforcing their Animal Welfare Act. All other states do. So there isn't really anywhere that we could use there. I guess in a similar capacity, the model that Mr. Davis just spoke to, where you have a level of and process of investigation, where you would have educational officers who go out and look to see if there isn't actually an issue with this particular animal or animals. They would determine whether that is just a matter of, oh, look, sorry, you just need to do this, make sure that you're providing the right food for you. Give a notice, we'll be back in 30 days. If you've done what we've asked you to do, no problem, and then move on. Is that kind of what you were asking?
Yes, I mean, it would be something like, say, the Environmental Protection Agency.
That's right, but it's somewhat like the stock panels, the local land services stock panels. That kind of model where there's a group of people who are there to support the farmer to get through this, whatever it is, whether it's sort of a mental issue for the farmer themselves, or whether it's drought or flood or whatever it is, to get through managing their stock. So that's kind of on a commercial but not dissimilar, I think. But I think the same sort of process operates, I believe, in most trades and most, even planning systems, where the local inspector goes out to check when you put your deck on or whatever it is. They're not there to sort of hammer you. They're there to say, listen, no, that footing needs to be a bit deeper or and so on. You correct it, and if you don't correct it, yeah, okay, the law will eventually come down and hammer you. But not initially. Whereas at the moment, unfortunately, with RSPCA, not AWL, it seems to be they're there. They've dropped into that pet shop and they're ticking a box and they're looking where they can get this person, and give them a penalty infringement notice or charge them with something. Different perspective on
Thank you
the
very
way it's
much.
done.
I would actually just like Ms Ward's thoughts on that sort of a stock panel type process instead of like an inspectorate.
Thank you. The stock panels are an example, and the other example that immediately comes to mind, just because of its sort of proximity, it's from this jurisdiction, is the Greyhound GWIC, Greyhound Welfare and Integrity Commission, I believe. Not everybody's favourite entity or organisation, but what those two examples highlight would be the need to make sure that any entity is truly independent, because the perception that these entities are captured by the sectors they're there to regulate and oversee is a huge problem, because it just undermines any confidence that the public would have in these putative entities.
Thank you. And sorry, my other question was to Ms Vesk, and it was just going off this whole idea that RSPCA is stepping away from operating a lot of these council pounds. So I've heard from places and people who are do volunteer rescue in places like Blue Mountains, Wollongong, Shoalhaven. I understand in some cases councils aren't even replacing some of the pound services, particularly around Shoalhaven, and instead are offering more ad hoc impounding services, such as relying on vet clinics to hold lost animals. I just want to know what impact this is having on the ground. Particularly, I know you are involved in the rescue of cats. What? It sounds like there's a bit of chaos happening here.
That's one word.
Yeah.
Is a disaster. And in my very long time at Cat Protection, which is 17 years, I've seen the consequences of the GFC. I've seen all sorts of times, COVID, so on, that have had a really negative impact on rates of homelessness of animals. I have never seen a situation as bad as we see it now. Our waiting list has never been longer. It's been compounded by the shortage in the veterinary workforce. It was compounded by shelters, a number of them closing to admissions because of the shortage of vaccines for cats. And, it's being compounded because we're not allowed to desex cats and let them be looked after by a community carer. They have to be registered to an individual person, and so those cats aren't being desexed, they're being bred. So, and then this is at the same time, as you say, so many shelters and council pounds have been closing or restricted. So we have a growing problem, and it's... Sorry, just back on, if I can blend that in with what you're just talking about, having an independent office, and the comment by Ms Davies earlier about a lack of will to investigate, say, a situation of cat hoarding. When you have organisations who make choices about what to investigate, I think they are conflicted by considering what the outcome of that investigation might be, which might mean a seizure of hundreds of animals, which is,
Might not
a
have
cost
space.
on that organisation. It's a major burden. So I think they're conflicted in making those decisions about what to investigate, because they might have to own the consequences. And this does sort of relate to the whole cat problem at the moment, because, people are really struggling and doing their best, but they have few places to take cats, and you know that creates a really dangerous situation for the cats, and a really difficult and potentially dangerous situation for the people as well, because they're overstretched, overburdened. It causes negative mental health impacts. And then back to that whole issue of, where might something independent sit? I mean, I think this is a public health issue and it's a public safety issue. And I think all the matters to do with animal welfare intrinsically relate to human health and welfare. And we need to look at it in that umbrella rather than as an isolated, separate thing. It's simply not separate.
I might just pick up on some of your questions there. Just going to your comment there, Ms. Vest, about that there's this inherent conflict in terms of deciding on cases if they have to seize a lot of animals. Do you see that actually being negated or resolved if we went to a government model? Because we see in government models where you have the EPA, for example, they're also limited in terms of what they'll investigate because of monetary constraints, time constraints. Even with ICAC, there are things that they won't investigate because of monetary constraints. Do we not just then replicate that same? How do we solve that problem? It's clear that we're not going to solve it by simply moving it over to a government agency. Do you have any views on that?
Well, I guess, firstly, I agree with you, but I think to some extent that's mitigated by if the agency doing the investigation and enforcement is then able to share the burden of the consequence between different players within the animal welfare sector. It's not, and some things I understand can be difficult because the animals may have to be held for a certain amount of time because they are like evidence. But I just think there's more capacity to share that burden across whatever it might be, council pounds, private shelters, rather than the one organisation, having to make this judgment and all its consequences. I just think there has to be that clarity in decision making. I agree with you that you can always have, very difficult and expensive consequences, but I don't think that is what should drive a decision.
Can I just ask a broad...
Yeah, I was going to say, can I add, Mr. Benassi, the AWL already have a scheme in place where they actually, when they do have a large number of animals come in, and to be honest, most of the time I've seen them promote cats, they actually utilise foster caring, and those animals are actually moved into foster caring while they're being waiting trial or whatever. So that there is that possibility of that sharing that Ms. Vesk is referring to. It's already happening in one of those two charitable organisations. It just would need to be expanded.
Can I just ask a broad question to all of you? Given some of the concerning evidence we've heard already today around the behaviour of some inspectors and the culture, is there a concern that if we create this independent office and we have this independent inspectorate run by the government, common sense would apply that a lot of these people from the RSPCA, the Animal Welfare League, that are out of a job will immediately want to apply for a job at this new inspectorate? Are we just transferring that cultural problem and that issue with governance and concerning workplace practices over into a government agency?
That's a concern, Mr. Benassi, but as Ms. Davies pointed out, it would depend who's in charge.
Yeah.
Her testimony continually said it depends who's in charge, who was in charge at the time. And if you've got a chief animal welfare officer who is properly able to do that, then there would not that problem would not exist, because those inspectors would either not last very long or would not get employed in the first place.
And the oversight and accountability that would
Would
need to be built into the system, and the management structure that I know we've been talking about behind the scenes, our committee, to sort of manage that process, hopefully, and I get it from other government departments I'm aware of, it's not a perfect system, that's for sure, but hopefully that would assist. But one of the other problems I was going to say, because on their annual reports, it'd be nice to know how much they actually spend on
Yeah.
doing compliance and enforcement first up. You
I
know,
was
at
just-
least let's know what the number is that both animal welfare and RSPCA, how much does it actually cost? Why that's not in their reports, I don't know. It doesn't make any sense.
You've read my mind, because that was the next line of questioning. Do you think their annual reports or even their financial statements, which are now suddenly appearing on their website, do you think they adequately delineate the different activities that they run and the different incomings and outgoings in terms of finances? Do you get a clear picture as to what's being spent?
Simple answer from Animal Care Australia, no.
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 I think that could probably be a simple recommendation of this committee,
Yep.
that when they come
Again.
back to the inquiry, and maybe somebody needs to
again.
move an amendment or something in Parliament, that to ensure that they do actually report exactly how much their inspectorate functions cost each year.
Yeah.
Could I just add to that? Like, because that, in the questionnaire that was sent out, and say 56 people responded, and also in the bulk of the submissions, that was the greatest call for greater transparency and accountability, the funding concern, and also the animal treatment and enforcement and legal framework. But the greatest call was for greater accountability and transparency in the reporting. So it sounds like you all agree with that.
Yes.
Indeed,
Yes.
indeed.
Are you?
Chair.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Are you aware that they also, as charities, have to report to the National Charity Register?
Yes.
Yes.
Have you seen the reports that they
Yes.
give on the National Charity Register?
Yes.
Are you aware that there are financial discrepancies between what they say on their annual report on their website and what they actually give on the National Charity Register? Have you
Yes.
aware of that?
We most certainly are.
Okay. Mr. Donnelly and Mr. Davis, can I just go to an example you had in your submission? And this goes to trying to get some understanding of what they're spending. You said that there were some birds that were seized, and then they were killed soon after they were seized, but the then owner was charged a total of approximately $20,000 in vet care and shelter costs.
Yes.
Are you aware whether that charge, did that come in the, was it like an invoice? Was it an itemised invoice in terms of this is what we spent it on?
We haven't seen the actual final court documents to be able to break that down for you, but what we were aware of is the final report that was produced by the RSPCA as to the outcome of that prosecution, and that's where that figure has come from.
Yeah, okay. And just one of the other funny money things that seems to be going on, you talked about pet food donations in your submission, and you give the example of the Royal Canin donation, or they received close to $1 million worth of pet food, which equates to I think you said $23.84 per kilo, which would normally equate to, that's the per kilo price for that dog food, but that company actually sells that dog food for like anywhere between $10 and $17
In a supermarket,
in
yes.
a supermarket.
Not Royal Canin.
Yes.
So where do you have any idea as to what would explain this
We
uplift
couldn't
in price?
But I guess that was why we put that in the submission, is because it is a huge question mark. When we did our research, we went to websites for Pet Barn, Woolworths and Co, and we looked up the prices of the bulk buy of the Royal Canin that they were quoting, and the prices that were on those websites for sale to the public, and we worked out the per kilo cost. That's the difference that we quoted.
Okay.
In
Have you
our
have you seen any similar examples with Animal Welfare Lead in terms of their financial donations that they
No.
receive?
No, we did not notice that in any of their reports.
I mean, the bigger picture is the people who are donating, including Royal Canin and other pet industries, but also individual people. My understanding is what they're donating to the RSPCA is for the rescue and for the
Shelter.
for the shelter type stuff is what people are donating their money for, and yet RSPCA is shutting down their shelters, and they're saying that they're going to do all enforcement. I wonder, what are people who are donating to the RSPCA donating to? I don't know. There's no indication in there because they don't differentiate between the two. But it seems a big mistake at their executive level to be removing the shelter stuff that I would have thought was why people donate, including Royal Canin.
Just probably one final line of question from me before I pass on to anyone else. Are you aware of the RSPCA's standard operating procedures document?
I have seen Queensland one and I have seen South Australia's one. I must admit I haven't seen New South Wales one. Having said that though, Queensland and South Australia's are pretty much identical to each other, so I would assume New South Wales would be the same.
Ms Ward or Ms Vest, have you seen this document or aware of this document? That it's
No.
essentially sets out the guidelines in terms of how the inspectorate's supposed to run and
No.
roles and responsibilities.
No, I haven't. But to your other question about transferring culture to a new entity, I think that if you establish a clear and accountable governance structure and you have transparent protocols, which is what you're speaking about now, I don't know what they are, but if you have really clear, transparent protocols, then, you know, they can be contested, they can be discussed, they can be debated. And if you have transparent reporting, again, you can see what is going on. And I think that if you want to build a culture in a new organisation, which is a wonderful place to start, is that it's from the ground up. It's about being open and honest and transparent, and no one gets everything right all the time, but the only way we can have any understanding of what is going on is for these things to be reported. And you know, we don't have an understanding of the deficiencies in, I mean, some of them we know because they're plainly obvious, but more to the point, you know, is there data that shows deficiencies in POCTA as it stands because there are X many complaints that are unable to be investigated because of threshold? We don't know. We know pretty much nothing from any of this.
Do you think this SOP should be actually made public on their website and as well as animal welfare's if they've got one? Do you think that would improve the transparency and
I
accountability?
think it would help people to understand how they're making the decisions that they make.
I question whether putting that up would have any purpose, because if I, as a person, knew what the standing operating procedure should have been, there's nowhere for me to go when it's not being met. And we all know that the SOPs at the moment that I have seen are not being met. Those standing operating procedures are not being followed.
Okay, so to pick up on that, to take your comment about Queensland and South Australia being very similar, if we assume New South Wales is very similar to the Queensland and South Australia, what are some examples where you would say that New South Wales have not been following those standard?
Well, the first and
procedures?
foremost aspect of the standing operating procedures is the education aspect. The inspector is supposed to go in, look at and assess the situation and determine what the next appropriate step is for that particular animal in the best interest of the animal, not in the best interest of the organisation, not in the best interest of the inspector's career, not in the best interest of whether we can promote that we've now shut down a puppy farmer out in Dubbo because their family had actually called the local council to say that my parents are suffering from senility and we need somebody to come and collect our dogs. Okay, so what happens is that standing operating procedure would not have allowed for an inspector to walk out into that farm, seize those dogs, parade them before the media and claim that they were puppy farmers when they were not.
And we've got an issue. I'm aware of a couple of situations that in the dying moments of the last government that a bill was passed. I think Ms Hurst might have put it to the House. That means now that people who get penalty infringement notices, whether legitimate or not, if they choose to go to court over that and contest it, they risk, if they're found guilty in the court, of being given a sort of a lifetime ban. And that's massively significant for anybody, particularly people obviously where it's a pet shop or something like that, but obviously for anybody who's our member. And that's a real problem too. And I think the intent might have been genuine and
Can I just
reasonable,
clarify
but
that that's only
unfortunately-
for really, really high level offences of animal cruelty, so it wouldn't be
that's
something
not actually. That's not actually. Okay, we can send you the documents.
No.
We've had
Yeah.
advice from DPI.
I'm happy to
legal
see those documents,
on that.
but
Yeah,
I
happy
did
to.
write
We'll
that
send it to you.
legislation, and so I know which
Yeah.
aspects of the legislation applies. It doesn't apply to smaller
More than
penalties.
happy to forward the details to the committee.
We will take that on
because
notice.
that's causing people to not to sort of just pay the fine basically because of that risk. So there's, and RSPCA are aware of that. Inspectors are aware of that.
To clarify, Ms. Hurst,
is my
our
point.
advice through the DPI, consultations we've had with the DPI is if you contest that PIN and you go to court to do so, and the magistrate finds that the PIN is legit, you are found guilty.
But the PIN
that's
is legit,
reported.
as in it is aggravated or
No,
serious
just
animal cruelty.
any penalty infringement notice that you.
But why would that be levelled up from a general animal
the
cruelty
advice that
offence?
we've been- that's
Because it doesn't
because-
apply to animal cruelty
that-
offences.
Currently, it applies to all offences under
No, not
POCTA.
automatic lifetime bans.
well,
no.
but-
That's not. We'll send you the details.
I think it's probably best
We'll
to send
you
us
details.
the
Yeah.
advice that you received, and then we can look at that. And we're getting
I'm
a
happy to
bit-
talk to you offline about it as well.
Yeah, love that.
Thanks.
That would be great.
I'm looking for other. I've hold you a bit of the time there. I'm looking for other people to jump in.
I was just to say, sorry.
I'm saving my fire.
Oh, do you go?
No, no, no.
I was to say,
I know what I'm
if
doing today.
an independent operation was, how would you see that funded, and where would the accountability be? Do you think that they could have an accountable organisation by having a separate one?
Well, firstly, we wouldn't see it as a part of the Department of Agriculture per
Yep.
se. It would not come under the Minister for Agriculture to answer that last
So
part
yeah,
of your
what would it
question.
look like, basically?
What it would look like, I would rather take on notice and provide that document to you, because that would outline that in far greater detail. And secondly, we've just been told, and we've just heard testimony that the government, the last government, found $20 million to fund an enforcement agency, one of the two enforcement agencies, I might add. We also know by looking at adverts online that roughly an inspector costs $100,000 per year, plus a vehicle, plus a few other minor expenses. So if you put that 100,000 into 20 million, you're certainly capable of covering quite a substantial amount of an Office of Animal Welfare Inspectorate plus staff.
Okay.
So if the money's already there, then why not continue to use it?
Anyone else?
If I could just add that the benefits of having a statutory authority is that you could build into the statute establishing the authority robust accountability or robust reporting requirements and any other sort of issue that could be dealt with at that establishment phase.
And just one more question. I think Ms. Vesk, you had in your submission concern for the shortcomings of the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. Can you expand on that a little, or?
I think, pardon me, if you go back a little while, there's been a few rounds of consultation on improvements to POCTA. One of the issues is that the bar is very low for what constitutes cruelty. And I'm just putting aside for the moment notions of where education is a completely appropriate response to a situation where an animal isn't getting the best of care. In cases of deliberate cruelty, or really like bad management that is not going to respond to education, the bar is just so low. But that's what I would like to know. Do we know whether the organisations are getting thousands of complaints that they are not pursuing because they don't meet the requirements of POCTA, but in fact they are, things that the public would see as mistreatment of animals, of animals suffering, but it's not being pursued but we don't know because it's not reported.
Because that's reported, like in that questionnaire, we see that the public is deeply concerned about animal welfare.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
yeah.
I think, I agree with you completely. People do care, and attitudes have changed over time as well. I mean, we're looking at, a really old piece of legislation, and science has changed as well, but 70% of Australians are sharing their homes with companion animals, and I think, most of them love them deeply. Some people know more than others about the best way to look after them, But, you know, whether people have money or don't, if they love their animals and they are doing their best for them, then as a community we should do our best to support those people. But when people are violent to animals, when they disregard their needs, when they act with cruelty, we should take serious action, because not just on behalf of the animal, although I argue that in itself is required, but because this is a person who has disregard for life, whether that's animal or human life. They disregard someone else's suffering, and we need to take that seriously.
Just further on the sort of funding it, an assessment needs to be done as well of the benefits of owning animals. Like, that's the negative side, and we totally agree that, you know, people who are clearly, you know, aggravated cruelty and cruelty offences under the Crimes Act and so on, you know, need to be, you know, that needs to be enforced for sure. But I mean, the reality is the majority of those 70-odd% of people who are keeping animals are doing the right thing, and there's huge mental benefits and physical benefits too, health benefits for the community. So whether that's kind of a good, you know, decent justification for sort of the government putting a little bit of money into this, society wants it. There's benefits in terms of mental health. That this sort of office also encourages people to keep animals. You know, that this is a worthwhile thing. That society supports this and sees the advantages of it and of doing it properly. So there's, do you know what I mean? Maybe you can kind of argue that to the penny pinchers when it comes to whatever this amount is. Is it 20 million? Is it 30 million? I don't know. I'll go back to just finish off with what I said before. Maybe the first aim is to find out, well, how much does it actually cost now for the limited compliance services that RSPCA, AWL, how much at least does that cost? So we can at least have some idea of what it would cost to implement this at the government level.
And that would then have what the community wants, more robust oversight and clearer accountability.
Yes,
in
clearer
your-
accountability, the ability to appeal decisions in both directions, whether you feel you've been abused or by an inspector, or in the opposite sense, whether you've reported an animal cruelty case and it hasn't been acted upon correctly. There needs to be an appeal process for both sides of that argument.
Yeah.
But this office is also educating the general public so that you know, good animal welfare is just what you do, you know?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Raising
Becomes the
standards
norm.
across the whole community. It's not just has to target the people who are doing the wrong thing, I get that.
Yeah.
But it's the aim of this office is to raise animal welfare standards, you know, across the whole state.
Which in turn then raises Ms. Vesk's concern and point that the thresholds are too low.
Yeah.
So if the public actually have raised their standards, those thresholds will rise accordingly.
So a more humane approach to
Yeah.
animal welfare.
For sure.
And it's no longer socially acceptable, you know, to have your dog chained up on a 6-foot chain all day or something to the kennel, you know. It's just not acceptable, and the neighbour and everybody else you just won't do it because you're going to cop it in a social sense.
Can I just ask, just in relation to that, so you would agree with the comment, and I'm just quoting from the submission from the Australian Veterinary Association, that the effectiveness of the law is not just about its existence, but also its consistent implementation and effective enforcement.
Yes, we would agree with that.
And I
I
guess
would
people knowing what the law is.
Yes.
Yeah.
At the moment, I think most people don't even know.
And I would add a
And neither
word.
do the vets.
I would add a word balanced. So balanced.
Well, I
It needs to go
quote
either way.
the a challenge is that POCTA is enforced by charitable organisations who are already under-resourced. In a study of 540 Australian veterinarians, dealing with a case of suspected animal abuse was the most stressful ethical challenge faced.
And again, that's unbalanced. Straight up, it's painting an unbalanced picture, so we don't have that balanced outlook or outcome.
Looking for any other questions from anyone? Mr. Murphy, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Fain,
No questions.
No. I'll hold.
Mr. Donnelly?
Patience is a virtue, Chair. Patience is a virtue.
I've heard. Just one before we let you go then. Mr. Donnelly, in your opening statement, you talked about a Great Dane incident where it was stuffed into a a cage rather than being taken in an appropriate manner to a vet.
Yes.
And then the animal was later euthanized.
Yes.
Do you feel the example of it being stuffed in a cramped cage to be then taken 40 minutes or 50 minutes from its owner's property to euthanasia, do you think that was an act of cruelty?
I do.
And if I'm talking about the same case where this Great Dane received medication that was later determined to have actually caused the physical decline in the animal, which then led to its euthanasia, would you say that is a case of animal cruelty?
I do.
Thank you.
We suspect in that case as well, just to the previous witness that appeared behind us, that was also the inspectorate trying to get back at that particular owner. There was a bit of a history of
Some anecdotal evidence.
going in behind.
Can't prove that.
The other thing, we haven't been asked about the Brumbies yet, which is a bit of a shock. Which, can I say that ACA is absolutely disgust. We agree with culling Brumbies out of Snowy Mountains National Park, no problem. We're absolutely disgusted at this 7.5 shots to kill any animal is absolutely abhorrent and shocking.
Can I just not sidestep the Brumby issue, but just go back to the Great Dane issue in terms of, it raises talking about where you said that the owner couldn't take it to his regular vet, so the inspector could actually hear about the treatment.
Yes.
This is something that we've heard several times where the RSPCA seem to disregard the advice or the treatment of that an animal's receiving from their local vet. They don't want to hear about it.
Correct.
Do you see that as
It's problematic.
problematic to not even actually look at that and consider that as part of an investigation?
It's totally problematic. If you were to flip that over to us dealing with a child, and that child has been taken because of some supposed claim of mistreatment against that child, then that child's teachers, that child's doctors, that child, everything involved, every other individual involved in that child would be questioned about what that child's health is like, why that child is in the situation that it's in. And here we have the RSPCA in particular taking an animal. They do not take on the consultation with the treating vet. They do not even actually believe the person that tells them that the animal is being treated. It's currently under veterinary treatment. This Great Dane was under veterinary treatment. The only reason that this Great Dane had not been to that vet recently was because this occurred during COVID. So they were actually not, they were advised by that not to actually take the dog down because it was under treatment. It was being treated. All of its illnesses were being treated by the vet just online. When they gave evidence in that courtroom that they had contacted the local vet to provide that detail, the information was that, yes, we confirmed the dog had not visited the vet recently, clearly because it was under COVID restrictions. They did not confirm that that dog was not under veterinary treatment. There's a huge difference in that statement.
Ms.
There's a
Ward,
huge difference.
you just want to add something?
Thank you. Yeah, very quickly, if I can just add that this is, we're becoming, or our office is becoming aware of this very problem across contexts. So it's becoming a real issue in the wildlife caring space as well. We've been contacted multiple times by very concerned wildlife volunteers who do an amazing, amazing job, but are so sort of, invisible, basically, that this is also an issue where you're dealing with wildlife under a very specialist set of skills and required to care for and rehabilitate these animals, that this exact scenario is happening with those animals as well, where the consulting veterinarian is not being consulted or regard had to the existing veterinary care that is in place as discussed between carer, licensed carer and veterinarian.
And to that point, I'm also aware that some of those investigations relating to wildlife, they are being instigated by Wire's executive in order to ensure that they can actually remove that carer because they have a personal issue with the carer rather than what the care of the wildlife is being provided.
Yeah, I've just realised we've gone way over. We don't have to leave you there. But thank you very much for your time, and we'll
I was about to say, I thought
bring
it was-
forth the
it
next
was,
witness.
Thank you.